Hey, hello Saints. I was having a cup of coffee here and it was a little risky because it's sitting on my notes it could spill, so I don't want to have a risk going on there. Life has enough risks. I really don't need that one. But you know, I wanted to talk about risk today, just in case you hadn't guessed yet. And risk is a human thing. God does not risk, and we'll get into more of that later. But risk is something we all live with. It's something that's part of our lives. A lot of us like to avoid risk. Some of us actually go into risk in order to have greater profits, say in the stock market. If you risk more, you gain more, that kind of a thing. Except lately, where everybody seems to be losing in that area. But we've been learning a lot about risk, and we've been warned a lot about risk, and we've been scared about risking in the past few months. But you know, every time we get out of bed, there's a risk. You could step on a Lego. Something could happen. When you get out of bed, that change in direction of your head could do something to you. In cars, we have car insurance to mitigate the risk. And mitigate is a word also we've been bashed with quite a bit in the last few months. Marriage is a risk. You don't know everything about that wonderful other person. There's a lot of unknown for us out there. It comes quite naturally to try to minimize risk. We move a baby's cup or an adult's cup farther from their elbow on the table to keep them from spilling. We take vitamins. That helps minimize our health risk. We avoid people who are coughing most of the time. We don't wear flip-flops when we mow a wet lawn with a power mower. That would be pretty risky or dumb. But in the life of faith, if we belong to the King, which all believers do, our risk has been, in many ways, all but eliminated. Not the everyday risks that we take just around ourselves. But, you know, Paul, the Apostle Paul, did not fret much about the risk of shipwrecks or the risk of preaching in a town and being sent to prison. He knew there was a risk, and he did it anyway. Or snakes biting him, or evil rulers coming after him, because he operated by faith. And faith pushes away this whole concept of fear and risk that we're confronted with. A very familiar verse from Hebrews 11 reminds us, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. And without faith, it is impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. I'm going to use the book I used last time I spoke on a Sunday from the book about Admiral Mitscher in World War II, and I think this illustration will help us look at this. And I love this story, probably my favorite story out of the whole book, who decided, this Admiral Mitscher, to take major risk for himself, and in time of war it's much more normal to do that, not less scary, but just more normal. And he took a risk for thousands under his command in the first battle of the Philippine Sea. Now Mitscher was the lead man on the task force, so there were several aircraft carriers, battleships, other ships around. He was the boss over all these ships and what was going to go on, and he was on the aircraft carrier Lexington. The last time I talked he was on the Hornet, but this time he's on a different ship. Now he's not a church-going man, but he did not deny God. He was a God-fearing man, but he was also a character, but he risked. Now one afternoon, Mitscher okayed a group of volunteer pilots to go out in search of a Japanese fleet. They didn't have the kind of things we have today from the space, so they had to send airships out and go look for the enemy. And then once they spot the enemy, then they send the other battle type things over there. And in many cases it was bombers, Air Force bombers, or Army bombers at the time. But it was risky. But these men, all these volunteers were all in because the reward of finding and destroying the enemy was greater than the risk of going out. Well, they did spot the enemy. They returned to their aircraft carriers. They refueled, and a strike was ordered for that night. And the admiral knew, and he was informed by others that verified it, that it would be pitch black when these pilots returned. So at 4 in the afternoon, in the middle of the ocean, they launched, and all these bombers and attack airplanes found the fleet of the Japanese. They sunk one carrier. It wasn't the biggest victory in the whole war, but it was good, and they damaged some other Japanese ships. Mitscher then, after these airplane pilots were done with their main mission, they were headed back to the aircraft carrier. Mitscher was speeding at 22 knots, which is as fast as an aircraft carrier could go in those days, toward where the airplanes were, and when they were coming back toward him. And then they would be low on fuel, and he knew that. Their best chance of landing would be to spread out, so some of the aircraft carriers are 10 miles in the front and a few miles back, so that these planes could come in and land on these aircraft carriers. Now the sky was filling up with scattered planes all over the place, over the other carriers, over the other ships, but there was no way in the pitch black on the ocean, and the lights were all off. You know how dangerous it would be for a ship at night to have its lights on with Japanese submarines in the area. It'd be like lighting up a target, right? There was even lightning on the horizon, and some of these airplane pilots were seeing that lightning, and they thought, oh, there's the ship, and they were flying toward that. So that was a danger. They thought it was a signal ship of some kind. And then someone shouted, we got to give these guys some light. And Mitscher's response, very calmly, as he usually did, no one knows how urgent his inner feelings were, but he said, turn on the lights. And so Task Force 58, all these ships, leaped from the darkness, temptingly visible to any nearby Japanese subs. But if you were a pilot flying in the dark, you would be overjoyed to see the runway lights on the deck. What a risk, but what a reward. There were cheers. The guys were shouting, our pilots are not expendable. Mitscher gave the pilots orders to land on any aircraft carrier, not just their own. And so they did. Some of them were out of fuel already, some of them were ditching in the water. Some planes that were already on the decks were pushed off into the ocean to make room for more of these planes coming in for a landing on these decks. 216 planes had launched, a great risk, knowing they'd come back at night. 100 returned safely. 80 ran out of gas and ditched, but most of the pilots, all but 16, were picked up. Mitscher was real good about that, seeking out and finding those who were lost under his command. That's a message for another day, perhaps. The seasoned admiral made a decision. He took risks for himself, for his pilots, for everyone in the whole task force. The pilots took risks, but the reward was a great victory. What a risk, and what a reward. Peter stepped out on the water. Risk, reward. Many men and women from over the years have risked all, and only in glory will we know what their reward is in total. People of faith risk something when inviting a neighbor into our lives. But as Brother Jared Hall mentioned in his devotion on a Sunday recently, the most likely way to get permission to share the good news to a friend or to someone is to be a friend to them. And that takes time. It's not as big a risk as some of these guys did that we just spoke about. It can be inconvenient, uncomfortable. It's a risk. Are we willing to take risks for the people that the Lord puts in our path? Neighbors, people at a store, whatever. There's plenty of risks for us today. We're told by a feverishly excited media about the risk of going outside or even touching a doorknob. It's risky. Don't do that. with a 98 to 99% recovery rate. Insert deep breath here. Yeah, there are risks, but they're not like the risk those pilots took landing on a moving deck at night in the ocean. And think of Jesus regarding risk. Did he risk? Well, at first, when you consider that thought, you think, yeah, he risked everything. Wait a minute. Did he risk? Maybe not. When you know the beginning from the end, there's no risk. There's no wagering. You don't need insurance. When you control the happenings of all mankind, there's no risk. But there is a great price to pay, as he, Jesus, volunteered to pay a great and painful price on the cross, going to the cross to win for us the battle of our souls. Now, if you and I were to live just one day in very strong faith, not perfect because we're still on this planet, but if we were to live with very strong faith, really going at it for one day, I don't think we would sense much risk because we know who holds the keys. We know who holds tomorrow. We might encounter danger or even death, but in faith, there is great security regardless of what we think of as risk. And we'll end with this verse. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5, "We live by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord, so we make it our goal to please him, whether we are at home in the body or away from it, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done in the body, whether good or bad." The moral of the story? Take a risk and enjoy the reward. God bless.